Hi, Professor Colglazier. Are you hearing us?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Yes. Professor, do you prefer William or Bill Colglazier when I mention your name?
You can use Bill, that's fine. That's my nickname that I use all the time.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Professor.
And do you want me when I talk to show my slides using share content, or do you want to show them from there? What would be your preference?
As you wish. If you prefer to show yourself, so you have more, I don't know, interaction. It's nice. And if you prefer that we can handle it for you, it's nice too.
I'm using an iPad. I think I can handle it, but it's probably safer if I had you show the slides. Of course, I'd have to say next slide, but that'd be fine. But I'm willing to do whichever you think would work best.
Okay. Marcelo, quando estivermos no ar, só me avisar.
Pode prosseguir.
Okay. So, I would like to welcome to Inside SP NTWAS 2021. This session is extremely important for us, and we are very happy to be able to broadcast that in YouTube. The initiative aims at expanding the reach of Inside NTWAS beyond the scope of the school by discussing now science diplomacy in practice, the role of science and technology advisor to the US Department of State and to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And we are having today Professor Bill Colglazier, Editor-in-Chief of Science and Diplomacy at the AAAS, and the fourth Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State in the United States from 2011 to 2014. And this panel will be moderated by Professor Dr. Marcos Nogueira Martins from the University of São Paulo Innovation Agency, AUSPIN. Professor Marcos Nogueira, please, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody. I would like to thank the organizers in the person of Professor Onuki for the invitation. It's an honor to moderate this session with Professor Colglazier, a fellow physicist. But contrary to Professor Colglazier, I took part in science diplomacy, like many others, as a tiny gear in this huge machine, mostly unaware of its workings. That changed last week, thanks to the interesting lectures I had the opportunity to hear, and I'm thrilled to hear Professor Colglazier's lecture on science diplomacy in practice, the role of science and technology advisor to the US Department of State and to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Professor William Colglazier is editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy magazine and senior scholar in the Center for Science Diplomacy at the AAAS. From 2016 to 2018, he co-chaired the 10-member group appointed by the UN Secretary General Science, Technology, and Innovation for achieving the 17 SDGs. He served as Science and Technology Advisor to the US Secretary of State from 2011 to 2014. From 1994 to 2011, he was Executive Officer of the National Academy of Sciences, a national research council overseeing studies, providing expert scientific advice on public policy issues. At the US National Academies, he is co-chair of the Science Diplomacy Roundtable and a member of the Innovation Policy Forum, the Science and Technology for Sustainability Roundtable, the US Liaison Committee for the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, and the US National Committee for the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Takes a lot of breath to say all that. Professor Colglazier, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm going to, and also I was able to hear just the last 15 minutes of Dr. Epping's interesting lecture in Swiss Next, and I'll be giving you sort of my perspective on science diplomacy. I have slides, and I can try to share content. If it doesn't work, I'll, let's see. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about science diplomacy. I'm sort of a practitioner, so sort of take a pragmatic view of science diplomacy. The topics I'm going to try to briefly go through today include not only science diplomacy, but also science advising government and the public, talk about some of the successes and setbacks of science diplomacy. Also, what I consider one of the great advantages of science, technology, innovation, the potential to leapfrog over sometimes diplomatic hurdles and find solutions that are new. Then the role of science, technology, innovation for the sustainable development goals, and then also diplomacy for the scientific enterprise. In terms of what is science diplomacy, I take kind of a pragmatic view, both science helping to advance diplomatic goals and diplomacy helping to advance scientific goals, and also this leapfrogging over diplomatic hurdles. As you heard from Dr. Epping, and I agree very much, diplomacy is all about national interest. And we used to talk, I've been involved, I guess, for 50 years in sort of science and international affairs, science and foreign policy. We used to say science and diplomacy, but we dropped the "and" to just say science diplomacy maybe 10 to 15 years ago. I actually like that because that really indicates we're talking about a mechanism, a tool for accomplishing concrete goals, whether it's scientific knowledge, scientific expertise try to advance diplomatic goals, or the other way around, diplomacy and the diplomatic tools helping to advance scientific goals. You heard about my science diplomacy experience. I started out life as a theoretical physicist, but I sort of switched over in mid-career to focusing very much on science policy and science advising and science and diplomacy, including overseeing studies at the US National Academy of Sciences, science advisor to the Department of State, secretary for 3 years, and co-chair of this 10-person advisory group appointed by the UN Secretary General to advise on science, technology, innovation for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But let me just talk a little bit about my background, sort of making this transition from straight science into the science actually interacting with society and with government. I really do this mainly for the young people in the audience to say it's very important to have good mentors. Back in the early 1970s, the AAAS created a fellowship program for young scientists and engineers to get the experience of working inside government for a year on a fellowship. I was actually in the fourth class. Then it was only for members of the US Congress. The person there with me, Representative George Brown, was a very interesting politician. He loved science, although he was not a scientist. I learned a lot about the political world from George Brown. The AAAS fellowship program now, I guess it's almost 50 years old, and now it has 200 to 250 fellows for 2-year periods working not only for the US Congress, but also in all the agencies of the US government, including the State Department. Along this journey, I had several other mentors I just wanted to highlight. The person in front in this picture, Paul Doherty, who's a very distinguished biochemist at Harvard University. He was on President Kennedy's Science Advisory Committee. The person in the back, Wolfgang Panovsky, world acclaimed experimental high energy physicist. Both of these individuals spent a lot of, they never served in government, but they spent much of their career also engaging, talking with scientists in then Soviet Union and in China about arms control for controlling nuclear weapons. In some sense, I consider them great science diplomats, although they never served in government. 2 others, when I was at the National Academy, Sherry Rowland. He was one of the 3 who won the first environmental Nobel Prize, the threat to the ozone layer from fluorocarbons. And through his work and his colleagues, also working with talented diplomats that helped achieve the Montreal Protocol. And lastly, I want to highlight Millie Dresselhaus, professor at the MIT, sort of known as the Queen of Carbon. I interacted with all of these individuals. They used their great scientific reputations to not only advance science, but also to advance goals that I think have helped to make the world a better place. When I went to the National Academy of Sciences on a sabbatical, just to tell you what the National Academy of Sciences was actually created by a charter from the US Congress signed by Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War. It was to create an honorary society of scientists. But it also had this phrase in the charter saying it would advise the American government and the American public whenever asked. And what that's evolved into now is a mechanism by using expert committees, roughly 200 to 250 studies a year done in terms of this advising. And my role for almost 20 years at the Academy was helping to oversee that process, providing science advice. Including the studies that were done were not only focused solely on US domestic problems, but a number were actually carried out in collaboration with scientific organizations in other countries. It had a sort of a twofold purpose. It was both to make progress on issues that both countries and science communities felt were important. But we also had another motive, at least on the US side, and that was to help strengthen the scientific bodies in other countries to become more important advisors to their own governments. We thought that would actually be good for not only for relations between countries, but also for progress in science, helping to lead to rational decisions. So this one was with China. Just some other examples, funded by the Gates Foundation for a decade. The US academies helped the science academies in Africa become more important advisors to their own governments. It even worked with countries where the US government and the foreign government were at loggerheads, bad relations. In this case, the United States science organizations working with the Iranian Academy of Sciences, leading universities in both the US and Iran, encouraged by both governments beginning in the year 2000, even when relations between the governments were very difficult, and some of that is still continuing. So these are all examples, I think, of sort of science diplomacy being practiced by non-governmental science institutions. A lot of studies also done at the academies when I was there dealt with issues of science, technology, innovation for meeting national needs, particularly economic prosperity. And this one was a study that was actually requested by a bipartisan request from the US Congress that actually led to more investment in science. The same sort of thing is occurring right now in the US, sort of there's not much that the two parties agree on in the United States right now, but one is sort of strengthening and increasing investments in science and technology. And one of the studies during my period that I was particularly fond of, called Science and Technology Strategies of 6 Countries, Implications for the United States. It was actually requested by the US intelligence agencies. They said, they picked 6 countries that they said were making very ambitious plans for increasing their capabilities in science, technology, innovation. And what they asked was, what are the best predictors for determining which countries are going to be the most successful in what they're trying to achieve? And we put together an expert committee, including people with different backgrounds and experiences. They looked at a lot of data, investments, and many other things. But they came to a conclusion that actually surprised all of the members of this committee. They said, if you had to pick out one factor more than any other that would lead to determining whether a country is going to be successful in achieving its aspirational goals in this area, it's the one factor more than any other is culture of the country, which I found quite interesting. Well, anyway, my experience at academies was mainly in terms of science advice in the case of the U.S. Academies of a non-governmental institution, conducting studies that were independent of government control, but made available to the public as well as provided to the government. And the U.S. government did not always like the advice that we provided. There were 2 studies done that came out in 1999 that both had a big effect on my later career. They were not funded by the U.S. government. This study was funded by a private individual, a gift, and it was as this title, A Pervasive Role of Science, Technology, and Health in Foreign Policy Imperatives for the Department of State. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, this was near the end of the Clinton administration. Actually, although the State Department had not requested the study, she listened to the recommendations, did not adopt all of them, but one that she did adopt was to create the position of Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. And later in 2011, when I retired from the National Academies, I was asked to take on that 3-year position, a non-political position. I was there during the terms of Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of State, and and also in part of the time was with Secretary Kerry. When I was Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, here are a list of some of the priorities for my small office. We were working with all bureaus and offices in the State Department. We're spending a lot of time engaging with other countries, from promoting science, technology, innovation to support economic growth and knowledge-based societies, enhance scientific capacity in the department. I mentioned those AAAS fellowships. Now they're roughly 25 to 30 each year in the Department of State, and there are roughly 70 former AAAS fellows who have made permanent careers working in the U.S. Foreign Ministry, the Department of State. A lot of work trying to help build public-private partnerships between private institutions, both private sector businesses, as well as with universities and others that help advance goals that are common to all parties. A very interesting one with Intel and government agencies was actually building engineering capacity in Vietnam. The issue of empowering women through science. And then this issue of everyone realizes now that the scientific and technological advance is moving at an incredibly rapid pace, creating all kinds of new opportunities as well as threats that can be transformational as well as create disruptions with society. So part of my effort when I was there was interacting with the US intelligence communities, trying to anticipate the implications of some of these rapid advances in science and technology that would impact foreign policy, that would impact countries. When I interacted with foreign countries during the term when I was the Science and Technology Advisor, both the science communities in other countries, as well as people representing the foreign government dealing with science issues, I was struck by, no matter what country I interacted with, no matter the level of development from the most advanced countries in science and technology or those that were emerging, the first topic they wanted to talk about was always the same. And that was the issue, how can science and technology stimulate innovation and economic development in this globalized, competitive, interconnected world? Every country was seeking to had ambitious plans for competing on a world-class level that they saw was essential for their prosperity and security. and they're willing to consider modifying their policies and investments to build a more innovative nation. And they want to collaborate with the most technologically advanced countries, which can be an asset, certainly an asset for US diplomacy. I think it can be an asset for many countries in trying to influence other countries. There was another study done by the academies addressing this issue of science in the US State Department. It came out in, I think, 2016, Diplomacy for the 21st Century. I like the subtitle, Embedding a Culture of Science and Technology Throughout the Department of State. Well, one thing that the creation of this position for the US State Department, it actually encouraged a number of other countries to create similar positions, including, I think there are more 6 to 8 and roughly 20 others that have someone in a position that's a kind of similar, although may not be the same title. And these foreign ministries actually created an informal network called FEMSTAN, the Foreign Ministry Science and Technology Advice Network, where they get together periodically to talk about how each is using science diplomacy and what, in some cases, might be common objectives. But going back to 1999, I said there were 2 studies done that year by the US National Academies that affected the rest of my career. This one was also funded by a gift from a private individual. It's not funded by the US government. The title, Our Common Journey, A Transition Towards Sustainability. It was looking at the issue of science and technology for helping to achieve sustainable development. And the title, Our Common Journey, sort of piggybacking on the famous Brundtland Commission report called Our Common Future, but in this case, emphasizing a journey, that is making progress on sustainable development was really a journey of interaction and engagement between the science and technology community and the public and the policy community, correcting as time goes on and making improvement. So all of you are familiar now with the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. While I was in the US government at the time, the goals were being negotiated. I only had peripheral involvement. But because I had been involved in that study that I showed, the 1999 study, there were a number of expert meetings that were set up looking at the issue of how science, technology, innovation could relate better to achieving the aspirational goals that came to be the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the SDG. And the diplomats created a mechanism they called the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, technology facilitating the Sustainable Development Goals. And part of it, they created an interagency team of UN and international agencies, an annual meeting held at the United Nations called the STI Forum, a multi-stakeholder meeting, and a 10-person advisory committee. In that advisory committee, I was the co-chair from 2016 to 2018. Interesting group, 5 from developed countries, 5 from developing countries, 5 men, 5 women, all very talented. The rest of the people, I learned a lot from them. I'm still involved with the UN on a couple of the issues that I'll mention. Well, that first 10-member group, we emphasized very much action plans and roadmaps and STI capacity building and strengthening science advice in countries in order to turn the aspirational rhetoric of the Sustainable Development Goals. It really requires taking action. And much of the action is going to occur at the national level. As we heard before, the diplomats, their main focus is on national goals, national interest. So we've sort of pioneered the creation of an initiative called STI for SDGs Roadmap, Science, Technology, Innovation for Sustainable Development Goals Roadmaps. And what is this roadmap? Most countries have a national plan, even if they don't express it clearly with those terms, a national plan of what they're trying to achieve for their own national interests. They often have a plan for how they're going to increase their capabilities in science and technology, and many now also have plans for how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that they think are particularly important. And these roadmaps are the intersection of all 3 of those plans, particularly what science, technology, innovation can do to help facilitate achieving these common goals between these 3 plans. And an interagency task team of UN agencies created a work group on roadmaps back in 2017. They produced a guidebook that was released and made public in 2020 on producing how a country would go about producing this roadmap, interacting with all sectors in society, civil society, the business sector, the scientific community. It's not just a top-down exercise. And now there are 6 pilot countries that are actually undertaking this exercise: 3 in Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Serbia, and 3 others: India, Kenya, and Ukraine. And roughly 20 other countries are considering jumping on board. I'm somewhat optimistic that this countries trying to achieve their national goals, but also at the same time increasing their science and technology and how it can facilitate their advancement. I want to highlight also one other series of reports from my time there. It was actually piloted by a colleague on that first 10-member group, Nakia Nakachenovic, who was at the IASA, the Institute for Applied Systems, International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria. And they produced several reports called the World in 2050 series. You can access them on the web. But they've emphasized 6 big transformations. And I think that's sort of a nice way to catalog where science and technology can make a big difference. The 6 are human capacity and demography. That's essentially improvements in education, healthcare, consumption and production, allowing us to do more with less, decarbonization and energy, food, biosphere and water, smart cities, and the digital revolution, which of course is affecting everything. Let me talk just briefly about successes and setbacks of science diplomacy. This is in 2019. I was invited to give a talk at the World Science Forum on 20 years of science diplomacy. And the issues where I saw, at least going up to 2016, where there was considerable success in terms of science diplomacy accomplishing concrete goals. One was in arms control. Scientists involved in trying to help diplomats, the arms control agreements, particularly between the United States and Russia. The poverty reduction, of course, great progress made by countries like China. Global health, I thought the global health community was probably the most sophisticated in terms of international collaboration to deal with things like infectious diseases. On science and innovation policy, with every country being interested in improving their capabilities. We had the Paris Climate Agreement on climate change. We had the Sustainable Development Goals on sustainable development. On science advice and foreign ministries, I mentioned that organization, FEMSTAN. There was also another very influential network created called INGSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice, which now has meetings of interested parties from the science community, from the diplomatic community, hold an annual meeting. The next big one is going to be in Canada this year, but also meetings held at the regional level. And also the contribution made in terms of relations between countries, for my country, the United States, with the time with Iran, with Cuba, with Russia, with China. Of course, in recent times, going up to 2019, there were setbacks on almost every one of these, particularly the responsibility of the US government at the time. Not only the US government was at fault, backing away from arms control agreements with Russia, backing away from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear agreement. So it all goes to show that politics is a more powerful force than science, or science diplomacy, at least in the short run, but I still remain an optimist for the long run. When I was at giving that talk at the World Science Forum, this was in November of 2019, I listed what I thought were my top issues that science diplomacy should focus on for the world. Certainly dealing with arms control, particularly with not only nuclear weapons, but many other advances in weapons. Providing foresight and dialogue on implications of these new scientific and technological developments, maintaining a channel of communication between estranged nations, accelerating global progress on the SDGs, and building STI capacity and developing and emerging economies. But note, I did not include a pandemic at all. Shows you that scientists aren't very good at predicting the future. I thought this was one area that we had things pretty much in hand, including in my country, in the United States, because there were plans on the shelf, talented people who knew exactly what had to be done if there was a widely spreading global pandemic. So now, of course, the pandemic did occur, and we're in a new era, hopefully getting to the post-pandemic era. So let me just mention what I consider to be challenges for the United States, the domestic challenges in my country in this post-COVID era. I mentioned I was shocked the US did so poorly in 2020, 20% of the deaths and 4% of the world's population. And the failures were not just on the political side, it was across the science policy society interface, including there were failures by scientific institutions like the CDC in the United States. But in some sense, the development of these new vaccines, particularly the mRNA vaccines, helped to rescue the US in 2021, but clearly we're not out. The US and other places in the world are not out of the challenges with this Delta variant. The uncertainty associated with the challenge we have dealing with the current pandemic. And looking back, why were these failures in the United States? And I think we could also say the same in other countries. It just emphasizes that sometimes more important than scientific evidence and societal decisions are matters of culture, values, ethics, trust, leadership, history, and politics. And that's especially true when there are large scientific uncertainties. Well, the new US government, the Biden administration, has made their domestic priorities the vaccine delivery and the pandemic in the US and government funding to restore the economy. But the challenges also include reducing the tremendous political divisions that exist in the United States right now, rebuilding trust in our democracy and science domestically, restoring confidence in the US among allies, as well as confronting the bad behavior of some autocratic states. But in terms of my list of international challenges for all countries in the post-COVID era, I would include these: assisting the developing world in vaccinating everyone and accelerating their economic growth. We know that's going to be absolutely essential in order to get rid of this pandemic for good. We have to move aggressively on reducing CO2 emissions and expanding green energy technologies everywhere. Yesterday or the day before just came the new IPCC report, which makes things look even more grim about how fast climate change is affecting our world. And if we don't do something about it, the problems that are going to ensue. Strengthening the science policy society interface at the national and global level, restoring some of the trust that has been lost between all three sectors. But then most important of all, strengthening international institutions and international collaboration to deal with big global challenges, including the next pandemic, including climate change, including the Sustainable Development Goals. I just want to say one last word about these emerging technologies, the fact that science and technology moving so incredibly fast, creating opportunities, threats, and disruption. You all are familiar with the list of all the advances right now with science and technology, digital and cyber technology, big data, quantum technologies, AI, synthetic biology, gene editing, robotics, social media, blockchain, vaccines. I mentioned about social media. When I was in the State Department back in 2011 to 2014, we did not anticipate how social media could end up being such a disruptive force to societies, which we've now seen in recent years. At the United Nations on these STI forums that they hold every year, the other big issue besides increasing capacity, country trying to achieve its own national goals in terms of science, technology, innovation, the other big issue is the impact of these emerging technologies, particularly the concern of leaders, how they control all the downsides. If you're interested in sort of this, trying to anticipate what might be on the horizon in the future, every 4 years, the US intelligence agencies produce a report called Global Trends. It comes out after each presidential election. So the most recent one came out earlier this year. And that most recent one is called Global Trends 2040. It's available on the web. I have the reference at the end, but or you can go back and look at the earlier reports from previous years, seeing what, at least trying to anticipate what might occur for the world in the future, what the various scenarios might be. So lastly, let me just talk about my priorities for closer collaboration among foreign ministries on science diplomacy. It's really pretty similar list to the one I gave in 2019 at the World Science Forum, except I've added at the bottom, as you can see, improving the ability to deal with the next pandemic. But also the question of what diplomacy can do to support international science, technology, innovation, collaboration. And these sort of come from my experience in the State Department. I found diplomats very helpful for trying to facilitate international collaboration, but I do think they can do more to remove some of the hurdles and obstacles that still exist. We're looking to advocate more for international scientific collaboration, reduce some of the barriers, including on visas, immigration policies, some facilitate new linkages, actually to seek new funding from governments to facilitate this international collaboration that can be an asset for science diplomacy. More trained personnel with backgrounds in science and technology in embassies, advertising domestic strengths to potential foreign partners, and surveying foreign capabilities for potential collaboration to help all scientific institutions find the right partners for collaboration. I also just like to say a word about priorities for closer collaboration among non-governmental institutions related to science diplomacy. That's universities, research institutes, even including the private sector. One is, I think the more we can do to increase collaboration on basic research and applied research, that's open, not restricted, particularly creating interdisciplinary research centers at universities, research institutes in areas relevant to our global challenges and emerging technologies. Trying to reduce these barriers to international scientific collaboration, but also with appropriate security safeguards to avoid improper behavior. And encourage collaboration of our non-governmental scientific and academic institutions on what's called Track 2 science policy and science diplomacy. That's outside of government channels, the dialogues between scientific institutions that can help to reduce tensions and create more understanding on what each country is trying to achieve, and perhaps create windows of opportunity for diplomacy. The US sciences, the US academies is still engaged in dialogues with the Chinese scientists, with Russian scientists, with Iranian scientists, and I think that's all to the good to continue this kind of efforts. In my last slide is saying that I still remain an optimist. So this is an optimistic personal view. I believe that nations can utilize their impressive capabilities in science, technology, innovation to influence sustainable development everywhere. To also increase the role of scientific evidence in decision making, to help solve global challenges, and to advance peace, security, and prosperity. Our greatest legacy. My career is coming to an end. For the last 50 years, I've been involved in these things. For many of you, you have the next 50 years, and when you're looking back in the year 2070, I hope you can say that one of the greatest legacies that was provided during this period was helping to build knowledge-based societies and accelerate the expansion of scientific knowledge and beneficial technologies that are for the benefit of human welfare. Lastly, my last slide is, if you want more information, just a couple of references. All the US National Academies reports are freely available on the web. You can really download a PDF. The little journal that I co-edit right now, Science Diplomacy, is also free and available. This guidebook on STI for SDG roadmaps is available from the United Nations, and the global trends reports that I mentioned. Now, if I can end screen share.
Well, thank you, Professor Colglazier. Are you? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we have several questions here. I will start with the first one, which is Mr. Rowland. Can you take the microphone and ask your question, please?
Hi.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing, but I don't know if you mentioned my name. Did he say Rolando?
Yes, I mentioned it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I just had sort of a comment, but also a question for Dr. Colglazier, basically focused on how, science diplomacy is most commonly or formally defined as a tool or platform to address foreign or diplomatic issues. However, in my short experience, coming from a small developing country with limited experience with science advice ecosystems, is that science diplomacy becomes sort of an umbrella term that can encompass both foreign and public policy to promote evidence-informed decisions and to let the decision makers know the scientific community. So at the end, also the SDGs are to be implemented at the national level through public policy. So my question is, if you have any comments in favor or against using the term science diplomacy in this broader or more general manner.
No, like I said, I believe in a pragmatic definition, trying to accomplish concrete goals, and that certainly can be accomplishing diplomatic goals, relations between countries. But I believe that the scientific information is key for the domestic agenda of countries for accomplishing, for example, sustainable development goals that are important to a country. So I certainly think you can use the term science diplomacy to encompass many different things.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Mr. Hidalgo, who doesn't have a microphone working, so he asked me to share his text. Dear Dr. Colglazier, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. And here comes the question. Based upon your experience as co-chair of the UN Advisor Group, do you think that the world diversity regarding concepts, approaches, and policy orientations on science diplomacy make a legally binding multinational instrument desirable or feasible?
Yeah, no, that is a good question. I believe for binding agreements between countries, that's all going to be determined by the politicians and the diplomats. But I think science can help, hopefully, to facilitate it. One of the great achievements I consider in science diplomacy was the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. As you know, they come out with the periodic reports addressing the issues related to climate change. There's also then a report that's for policymakers. It's actually negotiated jointly between the scientists involved in the scientific part of IPCC with countries' policymakers. And so scientists have really helped to influence policies through having this sort of a joint interaction through the IPCC. It helped to lead to, of course, the Paris Climate Accords. Of course, you might say, well, there isn't really a rigid agreement, telling countries how much they can emit in terms of CO2. However, hopefully it helps create international pressure for countries to begin creating their own instruments to reduce their carbon-based fuel usage. So again, it's really, science can help facilitate the politicians and the diplomats, but ultimately they're going to have the last word in terms of any agreements.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you. Now we have a question from Mr. Olagoke, please.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Now, the president of Ghana is one of the most eloquent presidents around here in West Africa. And one of the major points he raises about science diplomacy or the efforts of superpowers in West Africa or in Africa generally is that the contributions of the West, whatever the West seems to invest in West Africa, is often directed around things that directly favor the West. For example, if a Western country is investing in science, it's usually around science that, in quotes, favors the West. It's usually not solely about what favors the end country. Now, given your experience as a high-level government functionary, is there a way in which when Western nations are planning around their funding or their whatever they're going to do in countries, in third world countries, is there a way in which you can involve individuals from such countries such that you take into consideration their own plight? You you're not just building innovations that they feel is far away from them, but they feel does not directly affect what they want as people. I don't know if you understand my question.
No, I understand. My own personal view is that the West needs to help countries build their own capacity in country, their own scientists and engineers. And some of the efforts I've been involved in, that has been the main purpose. So the scientists in a country can actually, and their policymakers, to determine what is their own interest, and not from Western countries trying to impose on them. You know, in terms, I mentioned those STI for SDGs roadmaps. Ghana is one of the leaders in that exercise. It's one of the pilot countries, and you can find it probably on the YouTube channel or at the United Nations. In July, they held a very interesting session related to these roadmaps, and Ghana was one of the main sponsors of that activity. That effort I mentioned of the US academies on public health issues with African science academies, the whole purpose was not to tell countries or science academies in Africa what to do, but to help them build a capacity so they could make their own decisions. So I very much agree with you. The idea is not to impose on a country, but to help it develop its own capacity to make its own decisions.
Thank you. Now we will go to Ms. Trika from India for your question, please.
Thank you, Marcos. And thank you, Professor Will, for this insightful talk. It was really helpful for us to understand the basics. And so my question is regarding one of the points that you stressed on, that science diplomacy is being used to strengthen public-private partnerships for STI. So can you just elaborate on with like giving some example? I just want to understand how a science diplomacy strategies where governments are working together to design a technical strategy to do a collaborative STI. Like in India, the government is in forefront of performing R&D in the country while private sector is not that active. So how we can utilize the science diplomacy to strengthen the PPP culture in the country? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give you the example that I talked about briefly, but let me just also mention India is one of the 6 pilot countries for the STI for SDGs roadmap. So I think India is doing a superb job, both India and Ghana, in fact. I mentioned this public-private partnership that the big international company Intel helped to create. Intel has one of its largest fabrication plants in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And they hire a lot of Vietnamese engineers and technicians. But they found that the Vietnamese engineers and technicians didn't have all the skills that they needed. So this private company found that it was in its interest to help upgrade engineering education in Vietnam. So what Intel did was to bring in several other companies, to bring in the ministries in both Vietnam and the United States, USAID in the United States, science ministries in Vietnam. Also to bring in universities in the US, it was Arizona State University, to create a multi-million-dollar, multi-year partnership to strengthen engineering education in Vietnam. It's still, I think it's still going on, but it had a big impact. It was not only helping the universities, the technical schools, and the way they taught engineering to make it more inquiry-based education instead of rote learning, but also trying to help the faculty at these universities and technical schools to become more involved in the management and governance of their institution that could help facilitate strengthening engineering education. So I think great progress was made in terms of this sort of initiative of improving education engineering in Vietnam. And it was because you had an overlap of interest between the big private company, between the agencies, the government agencies in both the United States and Vietnam, and including universities. So for me anyway, I consider that a great success of sort of science diplomacy through a public-private partnership.
Thank you. I will ask
Professor Marcos.
Yes.
Amancio speaking. I'm so sorry. I have to leave in some minutes, but I wanted to thank very much Professor Brito, because Professor Brito made the bridge with Professor Bill. So may I open the floor for Professor Brito make some comments at this moment? Could be that way?
There was one last question before Brito, but go ahead.
No.
Since you have to leave. I'll go back to Mr. Cabral later.
Okay. Brito.
Hi, Brito.
Yeah, thank you, Amos. Hi, Bill. How are you? It's great
Hi.
to see you participating in the conference, and that was really a great talk. Congratulations. I have one question for you, which is the following. Could you tell us a little bit about your point of view from the United States regarding the recent changes in the world in the following, which I think affect science diplomacy, which is the following. For the last 25 years, there was an uncontested leader in science in the world, which used to be the United States of America. And now there is another potential leader or actual leader or becoming leader, which is China, which has ideas which are different from the ideas of the United States. How does this affect the way the United States sees science diplomacy?
Yeah, let me speak about it both in terms of the scientific community and maybe in terms of the U.S. government. Of course, the U.S. government, both political parties are concerned about China right now, maybe for good reason, maybe for not such good reasons, but they see it a lot of competition affecting the world. Now, the science community in the U.S. has had very good relations with the scientific community in China. In fact, after China opened up, a lot of their best scientists are actually trained in the United States. So a lot, and still, I think in terms of scientific publications, American scientists with Chinese scientists is probably, that for American scientists, Chinese scientists is probably the largest single other nationality involved in the research. So I personally think, and I think much of the U.S. scientific community believes that for basic fundamental research is very important for U.S. scientists and Chinese scientists to continue to be able to collaborate. With the U.S. government now very concerned about the security issues, there have been some inappropriate things that have been done, perhaps enhanced by the Chinese government. And so I think the U.S. scientific community very much does not realize there's an issue. And so we have to make sure that we try to ensure that the best standards of science collaboration continue, but they don't want the U.S. government to overreach and to go too far and to somehow limit at least cooperation in fundamental research areas. So it's an ongoing issue right now. I mentioned that there's an effort in the U.S. Congress that's going to result in increased funding for scientific research. I have to admit it's motivated largely by this issue of competition with China. So it remains to be seen how it all works out. But I think the science community wants to be able to maintain international scientific collaboration in fundamental science, open to all people, and not have it affect collaboration with other countries, including with China. I just might mention, and last, my good friend Brito, he is now a member of the 10-member group at the United Nations, which I think is great. So he's going to be carrying on the work there. He has also been the leader. We've both been involved in the effort for the American Physical Society to make it, try to become what are called a welcoming global hub for physicists worldwide. That is, try to make it help to meet some of the needs of physicists in other countries, not just emphasizing serving American physicists.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thanks, Brito. Let's go back to the list here. Mr. Cabral, please, can you post your question?
Yes. My question is actually related to the previous question, but more specifically pointing out to the issue of space exploration, what the scientific community in the US can do to contribute to reapproach the Chinese community in the space exploration? Because right now China is basically going on its own, is building its own space station, but and that may create some issues, tense issues in the future. So what could or should be done in this matter?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. In the State Department, when I was there is an office that actually deals with space and advanced technologies that worries a lot about exactly these issues. Of course, you know, with the US and the Soviet Union and US and Russia, there was this sort of collaboration in space was sort of an instrument of science diplomacy, you could say, in part. So I don't know specifically what the US government right now is thinking about doing in terms of engaging with China on space issues. A lot of the concern right now is on dealing with potential technologies in space that could actually be used, you know, for weapons. But yeah, I think it's a very important issue to maintain the dialogue between the United States and China on the areas of cooperation in civil space, certainly with cooperation in science in space, and also arms control, dealing with some of the other applications in space that could actually be harmful for everybody. So it's a good question. I wish I knew the answer of what the US is doing right now. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question from Mrs. Paredes Moscoso from Peru. Please.
Hello. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much for such great presentation. I was wondering, Dr. Colglazier, you mentioned that you're a physicist, but then later moved to science diplomacy, science policy, and science advice. I was wondering about the training that you needed to pursue in order to do that, and what would you recommend in order to make a successful shift? Because I'm a researcher I'm a biomedical researcher. I specialize in cancer genetics, but I'm thinking of making this shift, and I was wondering about the training that you went through. Many thanks for your response.
Sure. In my case, it was partly by having mentors in physics who were also, what I said, science diplomats. So just learning from them. They were passionate, particularly about arms control of nuclear weapons, and also on environmental issues. So partly it was just some of that rubbing off from these mentors. The other, of course, was this fellowship program I mentioned that permitted young scientists and engineers to get the experience of working inside the government. I don't know if anything like that exists in Peru. But there are a lot of sort of international networks. I mentioned this one on the INGSA, International Network of Government Science Advice. There is, I think, an affiliation in Latin American countries that you might find out more. The person who now has the UNESCO office in Latin America, in Peru, is a very good person. You might try contacting him. I can give you contact information if need be. He's very aware of science diplomacy and other issues. He might be able to serve perhaps as a mentor for you as well.
That'd be great.
Thank you. Well, the last question I have here is from Mrs. Garza. Can you please?
Hello, thank you very much. Congratulations, Professor William. I was wondering, you mentioned that there is a need of rebuilding trust in science, which is quite surprising for me because around the world, the impact of the US in science is remarkable. So how could you do this? Do you have some suggestions in order to rebuild the trust? And do you think those suggestions could be applied to other countries where science education is not as representative as in the US? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, my one suggestion, at least for the scientific community in general, is to listen more to what to people, civil society, what they care about. I'll just give you an example how I think that can help to build trust. You know, there was this the British petroleum oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico that blew up, that caused all kinds of havoc in the Gulf, and also at the fishing communities along the Gulf Coast and in the US. And the US Academy, based on that, it did a number of studies related to resilience. How do you define resilience of local communities? And the exercise that they found most helpful, both in learning about what communities cared about, was engaging in a dialogue with the communities along the Gulf Coast in the United States, asking these communities how they define resilience for their community. What were the things that might help them? So I think the scientists can learn a lot by trying to interact better with the public and listening, not just in telling what to do, understanding the needs. And I think that more than anything else perhaps can help to build trust. If I could just also mention one last thing, an interesting comment at the end of Dr. Epping's lecture about is science neutral? I'll give you my perspective. The conduct of science has values associated with it. We know what we think are the responsible values and how we conduct our scientific enterprise, and we hope that that's what everyone follows. And then scientific knowledge itself does not have values. The knowledge of physics, for example, but I think the conduct of science does have values. And I think one of the things that scientists can help transmit, at least to the wider community, is those values that we really cherish in the conduct of science. I think they can help influence the values. Perhaps I think they resonate with what we're trying to achieve with in society, and perhaps can also increase trust.
Very interesting. I agree with that. Thank you, Professor Colglazier. And I think we don't have any more questions. Gabriela, you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcos. Just to close the session, I would like to thank for all the knowledge that was shared today. Dr. Colglazier, it was really a high-level lecture, and we are delighted to have you here. And thank you, Professor Marcos Nogueira, for your moderation today. And this was the last session of the day. And tomorrow, we are going back to our program. The first session will happen at 8:30, and we'll discuss the São Paulo framework of innovation diplomacy deployed during the 2019 edition of Insight. And we will count on Dr. Gabriela Bortz, Dr. Shagun Basha, Dr. Ari Plonsky, and Mr. Júlio Oliveira, and it will be moderated by Andrea Mota. So, thank you very much to all of you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Thank you all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marcos. Bye-bye.